My name is Emily Hartwell. I am 42 years old, and before prison, I managed operations for a mid-sized manufacturing company in Ohio. I built budgets worth millions. I handled contracts. I solved crises for a living. But nothing prepared me for the day I stood in my own driveway and watched my mother auction off everything my father left me while I was still serving my sentence. And she thought I'd never fight back. Thank you for listening to my story. I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe, like, and hit the bell so you never miss the next one. Every share helps these stories reach someone who needs to hear them. Let's keep the conversation going. The gavel came down hard, and the sound cracked through the quiet morning like something breaking for good. I stood at the edge of my own driveway, 11 days out of prison, watching strangers lift numbered paddles over my late father's restored 1967 Mustang. My mother stood near the auctioneer in a pressed ivory blouse, chin up, hands folded, looking like a woman who had everything under control. She had not looked at me once. Not when I pulled up to the curb. Not when I called her name. Not when I asked her what she thought she was doing. She simply turned to the crowd gathered in the driveway and said in a clear, calm voice that everything must go. That it was all legally hers now. I felt those words settle in my chest like stones dropped into still water. Then the auctioneer lifted the title paperwork, squinted hard at something near the bottom, and stopped talking mid-sentence. He frowned and said slowly, "Ma'am, this VIN isn't registered in your name." 2 years before that morning, I sat in a courtroom in Columbus and accepted a plea deal I had spent 3 weeks losing sleep over. I was 42 years old and had spent 12 years as an operations manager at Denton Manufacturing, a mid-sized company in Ohio. I built budgets worth millions. I managed contracts. I solved the kind of problems that kept the whole operation from falling apart. The compliance violation that ended my career was not theft, and it was not fraud. It was negligence, a pattern of reporting errors across 3 quarters that I had missed while stretched far too thin to catch them properly. I was sentenced to 18 months. The night before I reported to serve, my mother sat across from me at the kitchen table, held both my hands in hers, and promised she would protect everything my father had left behind. She looked me directly in the eyes when she said it. I believed her because I needed to believe something solid. I served every single day of that sentence and came home to an auction in my driveway. The auctioneer's name was Burl. He was a stocky man with reading glasses pushed low on his nose, and he held the Mustang's title document up toward the pale morning light the way you hold something you are not sure is real. My mother moved toward him quickly, her heels clicking on the concrete driveway, hand outstretched for the paperwork. He did not give it to her. He read through it again, more slowly this time, lips pressed together in concentration. Then he turned to the crowd of about 30 people standing in my driveway and announced in a flat, steady voice that the sale of the vehicle would need to pause while ownership was confirmed. Murmuring moved through the crowd immediately. People looked at each other, then at my mother. She had gone the color of old chalk. Her hand was still half raised where she had reached for the document. I watched her jaw tighten slowly. The auctioneer glanced at me, then back at the paperwork, and said carefully, "This title shows a transfer, but not to the seller. This sale might not be legal." My mother grabbed my arm and pulled me away from the crowd toward the side of the house. Her grip was harder than I expected from a woman her age. When we were far enough away from the crowd, she turned and her expression had completely changed. The composed, polished woman from the driveway had vanished. What looked back at me now was something harder and uglier underneath. She hissed that I had lost the right to this family the moment I embarrassed them all. She said my father had verbally promised her everything before he passed away. She said she had sacrificed 2 full years managing everything I had left behind while I sat in a prison cell, and that I owed her far more than I could ever repay. I let her finish every word. I kept my face still and my voice steady. Then I reminded her that I had signed trust paperwork with my father 5 years ago, the week after his first serious heart attack, when he sat me down at his desk and made sure everything was properly and legally documented. She blinked. I stepped away and called the estate attorney who had drafted it. The attorney's name was Warren Pruitt, and he had handled my father's estate documents for over a decade. I reached him on his cell phone and he answered on the second ring. When I explained what was unfolding in my driveway, There was a pause on the line long enough that I thought the connection had dropped. Then he said firmly, "Emily, she cannot sell those assets." His voice carried a tightness that told me he was already pulling up files while we spoke. He explained that the trust my father had established was irrevocable, meaning it could not be changed or dissolved after it was signed and filed. My mother had never been the sole beneficiary. She had been left specific provisions: the house she lived in, a monthly income allowance, and certain personal belongings, but the Mustang and the lake cabin my father had owned for 30 years were placed in protected trust for me. Then Warren paused again before saying the words that stopped me completely. He said, "There is also a clause that activates specifically if you are ever incapacitated or legally unable to manage your own affairs." Warren explained the incapacitation clause slowly and carefully. If I was ever in a situation where I could not legally manage my own assets, including a period of incarceration, the trust required that a neutral, court-approved third-party fiduciary step in to manage everything on my behalf until I could resume control. Not a family member. Not a friend. A professional with no personal interest in the outcome whose only legal responsibility was to protect the estate for me. My father had been very deliberate about this language. Warren said the appointed fiduciary had been a financial management firm based in Cleveland, put in place before my sentencing date. They had managed the trust assets properly and professionally for the first 6 months of my sentence. Then Warren's voice shifted slightly. He said the firm had filed a sudden resignation notice at the 7-month mark. He said the paperwork offered very little explanation beyond standard legal language. And he said that after their resignation, the records became significantly harder to follow clearly. Warren investigated the resignation within 24 hours and called me the following morning. The Cleveland firm had cited irreconcilable conflict with interested parties in their resignation letter, formal language that essentially means someone had made their professional role impossible to carry out properly. After they stepped down, a replacement fiduciary had been appointed through a motion filed with the probate court. The motion had been submitted by my mother's personal attorney. Warren read me the name of the replacement slowly. The replacement fiduciary was a woman named Constance Albright. The name meant nothing to me at first, and I told Warren so. He asked me to think carefully. Then it landed. Constance Albright was my mother's closest friend and golf partner. They had played together every Thursday morning at Millbrook Country Club for over 15 years. They had traveled together. They had attended the same fundraising committees for years. Warren said quietly that he suspected an improper transfer of fiduciary authority, which meant the management of my entire trust during my sentence may have been handled by someone with no neutrality whatsoever. Warren filed a subpoena for the trust's complete bank records, covering the 18 months of my sentence. It took 11 days to receive them, and when they arrived we sat together in his office and went through every single line. The picture that formed was not subtle or difficult to read. During the entire period when Constance Albright was serving as fiduciary, large and regular payments had been made from the trust's operating account. They were recorded in the documents as consulting fees and estate management compensation. Every one of those payments had gone directly into a personal account registered to my mother. The amounts were consistent, monthly, and substantial. When Warren added them together, he set his pen down and pressed his fingers against his mouth for a moment. There were also several internal transfers between trust accounts with no supporting documentation attached to explain them. Then Warren drew a slow line under one specific entry near the bottom of page 4. The LLC that held legal title to the Mustang, the entity Burl had flagged in my driveway, had received a formal title transfer from the trust during month 9 of my sentence. Warren looked up at me and said, "I need to show you exactly who this LLC belongs to." The LLC was called Hartwell Holdings. I stared at that name for a long time because it was my own family name looking back at me from a legal document I had never once seen before. Warren spread the registration papers across his desk and pointed to the formation date printed near the top, 3 weeks before I had reported to begin serving my sentence. The registered owner of Hartwell Holdings was me. My full legal name. My Ohio address. My signature on the formation documents. I told Warren clearly that I had absolutely no memory of creating this entity. I had not hired a business attorney in the months before my sentencing. I had not registered any LLC anywhere. I had spent those final weeks preparing for 18 months away, getting basic affairs in order, and saying goodbye to the life I had carefully built. Warren studied my face while I spoke, and he believed me without hesitation. He said it was possible someone had formed the LLC using my personal information without my knowledge or consent. But then he leaned forward slightly and said, "There is also another possibility. Your father may have done this himself." Warren left the office and returned 10 minutes later, carrying a small envelope sealed with brown packing tape that had yellowed and curled at the edges with age. He placed it on the desk between us without speaking. My name was written across the front in my father's handwriting, the same careful, deliberate print I remembered from birthday cards and the notes he used to leave on the kitchen counter when I was growing up. Warren explained that my father had left the envelope in his professional care years ago with one clear instruction attached: deliver it to Emily only if she ever faces serious hardship. Warren said he had held it through my arrest and my sentencing, uncertain whether those events qualified. He said watching an auction unfold in my driveway had removed every remaining doubt. I opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a 2-page handwritten letter and a set of notarized documents clipped together neatly. My father's letter began with 4 simple words. It said he was sorry. Then it said he had always known my mother struggled with money in ways she would never acknowledge, and that he had spent the last year of his life making absolutely sure I would be protected no matter what came. My father's letter explained everything in his plain and patient way, the same voice he had used to teach me everything I knew about engines and balance sheets and keeping your head when things went wrong. He had worked with a separate private attorney, not Warren, a completely different firm, to form Hartwell Holdings in my name 3 weeks before I self-reported to begin my sentence. He had structured it quietly and told absolutely no one, because he had one specific and well-founded fear. He wrote that my mother did not understand financial boundaries when she felt entitled to something. He wrote that he loved her and did not believe she was a deliberately cruel person, but that love had never made him blind to who she actually was. By placing the Mustang and the lake cabin inside the LLC structure, he had built a legal wall around the assets he most wanted me to have. Even a fiduciary would find it difficult to transfer or liquidate assets held inside a properly formed LLC without triggering a mandatory review. Most importantly, he had known my mother well enough to know she would never investigate the LLC carefully enough to realize it already belonged entirely to me. He had built his protection around exactly how she thought. Burrell officially suspended the auction that same afternoon. He made a brief and professional announcement to the remaining buyers that the sale could not proceed due to an unresolved ownership question affecting several of the listed items, and that registered buyers would be contacted directly if a legal sale date was confirmed. People gathered their things and left. Within an hour, my driveway was completely empty and quiet. My mother stood on the front porch watching the last car pull away from the curb, and I could see from across the yard that the confidence she had carried into that morning was gone. She did not speak to me before I drove away. 3 days later, Warren received a formal legal filing from her attorney. She was asserting that as a convicted felon, I had forfeited my inheritance rights to the estate assets under Ohio law. Warren told me immediately that it was a weak argument. Felon disinheritance provisions in Ohio are narrow, specific, and very difficult to apply to irrevocable trust assets, but the filing meant we were going to court regardless. And it meant my mother had made the deliberate choice to fight rather than step back and face what she had done. I told Warren to prepare for absolutely everything. The hearing was scheduled 6 weeks later in Franklin County Probate Court. My mother arrived with an attorney named Philip Gross, who had built his reputation on elder law cases and had a particular skill for constructing sympathetic narratives around his clients. He spent the opening portion of the hearing describing me as someone who had brought embarrassment and financial instability into a family that had sacrificed to support me. He described my mother as a devoted and responsible woman who had stepped forward during a crisis to preserve what remained of a family estate. He used words like dedication and protection and impossible circumstances. My mother sat at the plaintiff's table in a charcoal wool dress and looked appropriately sorrowful throughout. I sat beside Warren and kept my hands flat on the table and said nothing. Warren waited until Philip Gross had finished his entire presentation. Then he placed the irrevocable trust documents in front of the judge and walked through every clause clearly and methodically. When he reached the fiduciary provision, the judge leaned forward, put on her reading glasses, and read it twice. Then she looked directly at my mother and asked whether she had read the fiduciary clause before assuming control of the estate. My mother's attorney objected immediately, but the judge overruled him without hesitation. My mother answered that she had believed her role as surviving spouse gave her the authority to manage family assets as she saw fit. The judge wrote something in her notes and moved forward. 2 weeks after that hearing, she ordered a full forensic audit of all trust financial activity, covering the entire 18 months of my sentence. The auditing firm appointed was based in Cincinnati with no prior connection to any party in the case. They worked for 30 days. When their completed report arrived, Warren called me before I had even opened my own copy. He said the numbers were very significant. The consulting fees and management compensation my mother had paid directly to herself from the trust totaled just under $140,000. Beyond that, the auditor had identified an additional $40,000 in trust funds used to cover personal expenses, home renovation costs, country club membership renewals, and a 10-day vacation to Scottsdale taken during month 11 of my sentence. The total discrepancy between what had been legitimately spent managing the estate and what had actually been removed came to exactly $180,000. Every single flagged transaction carried the same auditor's note. No documentation of authorization exists. When I was 8 years old, my father drove home a 1967 Mustang on a flatbed truck on a Saturday afternoon in October. It was the color of deep rust, and it rattled and groaned when they rolled it off the truck bed into our driveway. My mother stood on the front porch with her arms folded across her chest and said it was a waste of money, an eyesore, and that she refused to look at it every time she pulled into her own driveway. My father listened to all of it with his hands in his pockets and then turned to me and said, "Emmy, do you want to learn how an engine actually works?" We spent the next 3 years rebuilding that car together on weekend mornings. He taught me how every single part connected to every other part, and how understanding the system underneath meant nothing about the machine could ever truly surprise you. I thought about those Saturday mornings while I sat in Warren's office reading through the audit report line by line. My mother had never understood systems. She had always operated on feeling and assumption, and the belief that confidence could substitute for knowledge. The auditor's final page carried one more flag. Something that had nothing to do with the Mustang or the consulting payments. The lake cabin had already been sold. The auditor found the transaction recorded in the trust's secondary account during month 14 of my sentence, listed plainly as a property disposition. The cabin was a small A-frame structure on Clearwater Lake that my father had owned for 30 years. He had taken me fishing there every single summer until I was 16, and the memory of it sat in me like something permanent. The cabin was listed in the trust documents as a fully protected asset, exactly like the Mustang, meaning it could not be sold without a formal court order and documented fiduciary review process. None of that had occurred. Constance Albright had signed the sale documents as acting fiduciary, and the cabin had been sold to a couple from Dayton for $212,000. The full sale proceeds had entered the trust account and then moved out again in 3 carefully timed separate transfers over the following 6 weeks, each one structured just below the automatic federal reporting threshold. Warren traced every transfer to a personal holding account my mother had opened quietly during the second month of my sentence. The cabin sale was a clear, documented, deliberate violation of the trust's most fundamental terms. The buyers of the lake cabin were a couple named Frank and Audra Bellows, who had paid a completely fair market price and had absolutely no knowledge that anything about the sale was improper. When their attorney was formally notified that the transaction was under active legal review and that the sale proceeds could not be released until ownership was fully resolved by the court, they immediately agreed to place the remaining funds in escrow without argument. That meant $212,000 my mother had been counting on as accessible money was now completely frozen. Warren told me that within 72 hours of the escrow being confirmed, my mother's attorney contacted him directly. Not with a legal filing or a formal motion. With a phone call asking quietly whether there was any possibility of reaching a private resolution between the parties before the matter progressed further. Warren relayed the message to me carefully, and then sat back and waited. I looked out his office window at the street below for a long moment. Then I told him to call her attorney back and tell them we would see everyone in court. I was not angry when I said it. I had moved past anger somewhere around day 40 of my sentence. What I felt instead was clear and completely steady. My mother called me herself 3 days after Warren delivered our answer. She had never been a woman who cried with any ease, and so when her voice came through the phone carrying that particular thickness, I knew immediately how significant the moment was for her. She said she had been frightened after I went to prison. She said something in her had shifted in a way she struggled to describe, like a door she hadn't meant to close had closed anyway, and she hadn't known how to open it again. She said she had convinced herself that protecting her own security was the same thing as protecting the family. She used that word several times. Family. Then she said she was sorry and asked if we could sit down together privately and find a way to resolve everything before it went any further. I sat on the edge of my bed in the small apartment I was renting and held the phone and listened to every word without interrupting once. When she finished, I told her calmly and clearly that I was not going to settle this matter privately. The trust my father had built with such care deserved to be defended properly, completely, and in full public record. I told her I hoped she had strong legal support for what was still ahead. Then I said good night and ended the call. The full evidentiary hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in October. Burrell had been formally subpoenaed to testify about the morning he flagged the Mustang's title in my driveway. He arrived at the courthouse in a brown jacket that looked like he had pressed it carefully for the occasion, and he answered Warren's questions in the same flat, unhurried manner he had used standing in my driveway 8 months earlier. He explained that he had been conducting estate auctions professionally for 22 years and that he reviewed every title document personally before calling a single bid. He said the Mustang's title had shown a corporate ownership marker indicating the vehicle was held inside a registered LLC, which automatically required him to pause and verify the selling party's authority. He said he had almost moved past it because the LLC carried a family name and he had briefly assumed it was a family business entity the seller controlled. But something made him check the state registration anyway. Warren asked him what would have happened if he had not checked. Burrell looked directly at the judge and said the car would have been sold without clean legal title, and the buyer would have had no valid claim of ownership. The courtroom stayed very quiet after that. The judge was already writing steadily in her notes. The judge delivered her ruling on a Monday morning. I sat beside Warren with my hands flat on the table in front of me and kept my breathing steady while the clerk read the findings into the record. Unauthorized asset liquidation. Breach of fiduciary duty. Misappropriation of protected trust funds. The court found that Constance Albright had acted improperly and outside her legal authority as replacement fiduciary, and that my mother had received trust funds she had no legal right to access or direct under any interpretation of the original trust document. The ruling ordered full restitution to the trust covering every dollar that had been improperly removed, plus accumulated interest calculated from the date of each unauthorized transfer. The total restitution figure came to $198,000. Warren leaned over quietly and told me the court had also referred the manner of the cabin sale to the county prosecutor's office for separate review. My mother's attorney had argued for a structured repayment arrangement spread over several years. The judge denied it without extended discussion. Full restitution was due within 90 days. My mother did not have $198,000 in liquid accessible funds. The only asset she held outright that could satisfy that order was the house she had lived in for 30 years. The weeks following the ruling moved quickly for me, and I imagined very slowly for my mother. Her attorney filed supplementary motions, challenging portions of the judgment. The court addressed each one methodically and denied the majority without significant comment. The social world my mother had maintained with tremendous and consistent effort for 3 decades began to quietly contract around her. Her country club friendships, the women she had lunched with and traveled with and chaired committees alongside for years, started to pull back in the small but unmistakable ways that social circles do when someone becomes a liability. Phone calls went unreturned. Her name disappeared from invitation lists. The image she had constructed and maintained so carefully, the composed, capable widow managing her late husband's estate with grace and dignity, had fractured in a documented and public way that no amount of composure could repair. She was not a monster in the simple sense of the word. But she had done something that left a permanent and visible record, and the people in her world understood that clearly and responded accordingly. Then her attorney filed a formal appeal challenging both the restitution amount and the core finding of breach of fiduciary duty. Warren read the filing and told me it was unlikely to change anything. But it introduced one more thing I had not yet known. The appeal was heard and formally denied 4 months after it was filed. The original ruling stood completely intact. But during the appeal proceedings, Warren had conducted one final thorough review of all the trust documents, checking carefully for anything that might surface as a future challenge before the case closed permanently. He found something in the original trust language that he told me honestly he had missed on his first full reading. It was a final clause added in my father's own handwriting as a separately notarized amendment to the main document. It stated clearly that if the primary trust beneficiary successfully defended the trust against any unauthorized legal challenge or improper action by any party, full and immediate control of all remaining trust assets would transfer to the beneficiary without any additional probate proceeding required. Warren read it to me twice and then set the document down and looked at me steadily. He said my father had added it as if he had known with quiet certainty that one day someone would attempt exactly what my mother had attempted. And he had made sure that successfully defending what he built would carry something beyond mere restoration. The moment the appeal was formally denied, I had complete, immediate, and entirely unchallenged control of the full Hartwell estate. I called Burrell 2 weeks after the appeal denial was confirmed. I told him I wanted to hold an auction at my property on a Saturday morning and asked if he was available. He asked what I was planning to sell. I told him I would explain everything when he arrived. On a clear morning in early spring, Burrell set up his table and his microphone in the same driveway where 8 months earlier he had stopped a sale that had no legal right to proceed. A crowd gathered, mostly neighbors and a handful of car collectors who had heard about the Mustang through local enthusiast networks. The 1967 Mustang sat at the center of the driveway in the soft morning light, freshly detailed, chrome-polished, looking exactly like what it truly was. A machine my father and I had rebuilt together with our own hands across 3 years of Saturday mornings when I was a child, and he was trying to teach me everything important he knew. Burrell looked over at me with his pen ready and gave a short professional nod. I stood beside him and looked at that car for a long quiet moment. Then I shook my head slowly. Burrell lowered his pen and smiled like a man who had suspected that answer all along. He picked up his microphone and told the assembled crowd that the Mustang had been withdrawn from sale by the owner. It was not available. It was going home. 3 months later, I stood at a podium inside a conference room at the Franklin County Public Library. The room was full in a way that surprised me. Attorneys and educators and social workers and women I had never met who had driven across the city because they had seen the announcement and recognized something in its purpose that mattered personally to them. I had refinanced the lake cabin, which had been legally restored to the trust after the Bellows sale was carefully unwound, and Frank and Audra were fully compensated for the disruption. The refinancing provided enough working capital to restore the complete estate to financial health and still leave a meaningful amount available for something my father would have approved of without hesitation. I used it to establish the Harold Hartwell Scholarship Fund, named for my father, dedicated specifically to women rebuilding their professional lives and their sense of possibility after incarceration. The board chair read my father's full name aloud during her remarks, and I had to look at the ceiling briefly before I could respond without my voice breaking. When the formal portion ended and people gathered in small conversations around the room, I looked toward the back row almost without meaning to. My mother was sitting in the last seat in a simple gray coat with her hands in her lap, watching me with an expression I had genuinely never seen on her face in 42 years of knowing her. The room had mostly emptied by the time she made her way toward me. The catering staff were quietly collecting glasses, and the board members had gathered near the exit in easy conversation. She walked more slowly than I remembered, and with less certainty about where she was going. She had always moved through rooms with a kind of directed purpose that made other people naturally step aside for her. Now she moved like someone paying careful attention to each step. She stopped a short distance away and looked at me without speaking for a moment. Then she said, in a voice that was quieter and smaller than I had ever heard from her in my entire life, that she had never believed I would recover from prison. She said she had sat in that courtroom on the day of my sentencing and made a decision in her mind that the version of me she had always known was finished. I held her gaze and let every word land exactly where it needed to land. Then I told her calmly and without any bitterness that she had sold my assets. She had tried to sell my father's car in my own driveway. She had taken money that was never hers and spent 18 months quietly dismantling what he had spent years carefully building for me. And she had done all of it because she had looked at me and decided I was someone who could be erased. I told her she had underestimated my name. I did not say it with cruelty. I said it the way you state something that has already been proven true and needs no further argument. Then I picked up my folder from the table beside me, said goodnight to her, and walked out through the front doors into the cool spring evening. The Mustang was parked at the curb exactly where I had left it. Engine rebuilt. Title clean. Registered in my name without question or condition. I got in, turned the key, and it started on the first try, exactly the way my father had always said a well-built thing should. I drove home through the quiet streets and did not look in the mirror once.